Good morning. I am Dr. M. Subha, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Amat University, Chennai, India. Welcome to today's class. We are going to have the prose, The Portrait of a Lady, written by Kushwant Singh. Kushwant Singh was an Indian writer, lawyer, politician, journalist, and a diplomat. He lived in between 2nd February 1915 and 20th March 2014. His well known novel is Train to Pakistan, which was published in the year 1956. In this prose, The Portrait of a Lady, Kushwant Singh documents his sweet association with his grandmother, which is autobiographical in nature. He talks about his relationship with his grandmother and how he relished those days. First paragraph. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband. But that was hard to believe. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. As for my grandmother, being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child that seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. So often, the grandson used to hear the stories narrated by the grandmother. She narrated the stories or the life that she lived when she was young. But this small boy is not able to accept or even imagine that the grandmother was long, long ago young and the grandfather was also young. So he is not matured and aged enough to imagine his grandparents that they were young long ago. Second paragraph. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain. She had always been as she had known her, old, so terribly old, that she could not have grown older and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop and the other telling the beads of a rosary. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over the pale, puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountain, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. According to this small young narrator, who is the grandson, the grandmother looked so beautiful. Though she was not pretty, she looked so beautiful, like the white covered snow on the mountain. Her attire looked so graceful, so beautiful, with white hair. She was hobbling in the house with rosary beads to utter prayers. She was always chanting mantra or the prayer. And absolutely, she was so beautiful to this grandson. My grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing song while she bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. I listened because I loved her voice, but never bothered to learn it. Then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen ink pot, and a red pen. Tie them all in a bundle and hand it to me. After a breakfast of a thick, stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. In the morning, this grandmother used to make the grandson ready. He was left under the care of the grandmother. Parents have left for the, the city to carry on with their schedule. And the morning, this grandmother used to say the prayer, expecting that the grandson would learn it sooner or later. But the small young mind is not with the intention to learn the prayer, but he was so fond of the voice of this grandmother. So he listened to it. Morning, they used to wind up their breakfast with chapati and butter or sugar spread. Then they used to leave for their school. And the grandmother always used to accompany the grandson. She used to pack some chapati with her so that she could offer it to the village dogs. Next paragraph. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer, while the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda, singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus. My grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. When we had both finished, we would walk back together. This time, the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis we threw to them. So, morning, the grandmother used to drop the grandson in his school, then go to the adjacent temple. She used to spend the whole day in the temple. By the evening, grandson will also come out of the school, and the grandmother from the temple, they used to get back to their home. On their way back, they used to distribute the chapatis they packed in the morning to the street dogs. Next paragraph. When my parents were comfortably settled in the city, they sent for us. That was a turning point in our friendship. Although we shared the same room, my grandmother no longer came to school with me. I used to go to an English school in a motor bus. There were no dogs in the streets, and she took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of our city house. So sooner they got communication from their parents to shift to the city. In the city, the grandson went to an English school in a motor bus, and the grandmother was not able to accompany the grandson. So she started spending time with the sparrows in her house. Next paragraph. As the years rolled by, we saw less of each other. For some time, she continued to wake me up and get me ready for school. When I came back, she would ask me what the teacher had taught me. I would tell her English words and little things of Western science and learning, the law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, the world being round, etc. This made her unhappy. She could not help me with my lessons. She did not believe in the things they taught at the English school and was distressed that there was no teaching about God and the scriptures. One day, I announced that we were being given music lessons. She was very disturbed. To her, music had lewd associations. It was the monopoly of harlots and beggars and not meant for gentlefolk. She said nothing, but her silence meant disapproval. She rarely talked to me after that. Here, in the city life, his education was altogether different, and the grandmother did not approve it. She secluded herself with her birds. When I went up to university, I was given a room of my own. The common link of friendship was snapped. My grandmother accepted her seclusion with resignation. She rarely left her spinning wheel to talk to anyone. From sunrise to sunset, she sat by her wheel, spinning and reciting prayers. Only in the afternoon, she relaxed for a while to feed the sparrows, while she sat in the veranda, breaking the bread into little bits. Hundreds of little birds collected round her, creating a veritable bedlam of chirrupings. Some came and perched on her legs, others on her shoulders. Some even sat on her head. She smiled but never shooed them away. It was to be the happiest half hour of the day for her. So the grandson grew up. He started going to the university, and the grandmother, still in seclusion, spending more time with the birds and with her prayer. And during the afternoon time, she used to put some bread to the birds. This is how their sweet friendship and association was distanced slightly. Next paragraph. When I decided to go abroad for further studies, I was sure my grandmother would be upset. I would be away for 5 years, and at her age, one could never tell, but my grandmother could. She was not even sentimental. She came to leave me at the railway station but did not talk or show any emotion. Her lips moved in prayer. Her mind was lost in prayer. Her fingers were busy telling the beads of a rosary. Silently, she kissed my forehead, and when I left, I cherished the most imprint as perhaps the last sign of physical contact between us. This is how the grandson thought when he left for overseas to continue his studies, that this is the last touch, last kiss that he received from his grandmother. Okay, because he is going to spend there nearly 5 years continuing his high studies. But this grandmother is very mature. He was not emotional. She maintained a composed posture. Next paragraph. But that was not so. After 5 years, I came back home and was met by her at the station. She did not look a day older. She still had no time for words, and while she clasped me in her arms, I could hear her reciting her prayers. Even on the first day of my arrival, her happiest moments were with her sparrows, whom she fed longer and with frivolous rebukes. So, after 5 years, after completing the studies, the grandson came back and saw the same old grandmother spending sweet time with her prayer and birds. Next paragraph. In the evening, a change came over her. She did not pray. She collected the women of the neighborhood, got an old drum, and started to sing for several hours. She thumped the sagging skins of the dilapidated drum and sang of the homecoming of warriors. We had to persuade her to stop to avoid overstraining. That was the first time since I had known her that she did not pray. So, that particular evening, there was a mentionable change in her behavior, that she was singing and dancing somehow, and the members of the family found it quite uncommon, and she did not pray, which was noticed by everyone. Next paragraph. The next morning, she was taken ill. It was mild fever, and the doctor told us that it would go. But my grandmother thought differently. She told us that her end was near. She said that since only a few hours before the close of the last chapter of her life, she had omitted to pray. She was not going to waste any more time talking to us. So the next morning, she had mild fever, mild sickness, but she could foresee her death. As a pious religious person, she had that vision of her death. So she revealed it to her relatives, son, grandson, to all, which is a common scenario in India. Next paragraph. We protested, but she ignored our protests. She lay peacefully in bed, praying and telling her beads. Even before we could suspect, her lips stopped moving and the rosary fell from her lifeless fingers. A peaceful pallor spread on her face, and we knew that she was dead. The grandmother passed away. The rosary beads fell down from her fingers, and the prayers stopped. We lifted her off the bed and, as is customary, laid her on the ground and covered her with a red shroud. After a few hours of mourning, we left her alone to make arrangements for her funeral. In the evening, we went to her room with a crude stretcher to take her to be cremated. The sun was setting and had lit the room and veranda with a blaze of golden light. We stopped halfway in the courtyard, all over the veranda, and in a room right up to where she lay dead and stiff wrapped in the red shroud. Thousands of sparrows sat scattered on the floor. There was no chirruping. We felt sorry for the birds, and my mother fetched some bread for them. She broke it into little crumbs the way my grandmother used to, and threw it to them. The sparrows took no notice of the bread. When we carried my grandmother's corpse off, they flew away quietly. Next morning, the sweeper swept the bread crumbs into the dustbin. So, even the birds came to attend the funeral of the grandmother, and when the food was offered during funeral to the birds by the grandson's mother, they refused to eat it, and the very next morning, after the funeral, those bread pieces were swept by the sweeper. This prose talks about the nice, unforgettable association between the grandson and the grandmother, which is a very common, universal representation of human relationship and Indian in particular. This grandson, who is Kushwant Singh himself, has documented Indian ethos, human life, and human relationship through this prose. Thank you.